This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team. Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor of social psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zeng. I'm a psychologist and a research assistant at the University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Joyce, and I'm a student of psychological science student at the University of Queensland.
And thank you, Joyce and Andrea, for coming along today. We're going to make a video, as we've been making videos about every chapter of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And this chapter is chapter 5, and I'll just read off the title I located. So this chapter is about geographies of Latin American social environmental movements, defending territories and lifeways in the face of violent extractivism. And the author is Joel Correa, and he's an assistant professor at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And he works in geography, looking at the intersection of indigenous politics, land rights, social environmental injustice, and law. I guess one question that people have is, what is extractivism? Andrea, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So extractivism is actually the process of extracting the natural resources from Earth and to sell on the world market. It is always found in an economy that depends primarily on the extraction or removal of natural resources that are considered valuable for exportation worldwide.
Yeah. And so in the context of Latin America, we're really talking about movements that are protesting, the destruction of the rainforest in the Amazon, or the oil fields and minerals around Latin America. Why does the author find it so important to emphasize a social environmental movement?
Yes, so actually, the chapter kind of explains why extractivism is kind of facilitate the emergence of social environmental movements. And I think the logic back there is that it is impossible to separate social aspect from the environmental movement in Latin America, because extractivism is also kind of goes hand in hand with colonialism in Latin America. And there is also related, the extractivism, like the exploiting relationship, is closely related to like racialization, inequality, and environmental injustice. And so this kind of exploitative relationship kind of stirs the movement of indigenous community to reclaim their lands, and which sets the origins of social environmental movements.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess that's so powerful, not just for Latin America, but really around the world. So, looking at the present, it's easy to forget, but actually there have been decades and centuries of environmental destruction, and it's often been part of a movement where foreign companies or invaders kind of come in and plunder the environment, and local people are cheated of their resources, and their well-being suffers. And so that's the social environmental movement is not just about protecting the environment, but protecting indigenous people's lifeways, as he calls it. So that's really the first part of the chapter. And the second part of the chapter talks about a new tool that he's really excited about called counter mapping. Joyce, what is counter mapping?
Okay, so the concept of counter mapping is basically academics and the public work together and to record environmental movements around the world. And sometimes it can be regional, it can be global as well. One of the most well-known project is the Environmental Justice Atlas. So it is an open access project, and it records environmental conflicts around the world.
Yeah, and so part of the idea there is that mapping in the old days is really a tool of the state, and people create these maps for national borders to assert claims over the natural world and with regard to politics. But this counter mapping is really supposed to empower communities and put their justice concerns on the world stage. And then in the last section, the focus of the author is on violence against environmental defenders. And that ties in with what Joyce said on counter mapping. So the idea is that in counter mapping, people can put up when atrocities occur, when people are assassinated or beaten up or imprisoned, who are speaking up for the environment. And so that work actually is not as fringe as you might think. So many dozens or even hundreds or thousands of people have been experiencing violence at the hands of corporations and the state for speaking up for these social environmental movements. And so the scholarship of that has really been just trying to document that it's happening and bring it to the attention of the world. And of course, that is meant to empower people to resist and question it. So when we look at the products that we buy in the global north or around the world, we can be aware of the ways that the companies need to be held accountable for actions on the ground. And I certainly think we all agree with that. It's a really sobering part of the chapter. And another point that the author makes in this section that just really needs to be repeated is that it's not just the direct violence against protesters that's a concern. It's the ongoing indirect violence where people are being dispossessed of their land. Maybe they have become refugees, or their lands are poisoned, or their water is poisoned. So that's also a form of violence in the environmental movement that really hasn't been talked about enough and studied enough. I guess like when I think about this chapter, I actually learned an enormous amount. As a former Canadian now based in Australia, I didn't know a lot about Latin American environmental movements or social environmental movements. And I think the concept of social environmental movements draws attention to the political and historical aspect of environmentalism and extractivism that is really important. And even though I didn't know the term before I started reading the book, extractivism is actually such an important aspect of the environmental movements. Like we can study and talk about environmentalists, but until we also study and talk about extractivism and where it comes from and why it's so destructive, we're not going to be able to fully understand what's going on. What about you, Andrea? What did you take from the chapter?
Yeah, I really I learned a lot from Latin American and their movements in this chapter. And what I think I learned most is like besides the direct violence, there are like other forms of violence against the environmental movement actors, and they could be like legal reforms to criminalizing the protest, and also like there are corruptions in criminal justice system that contributes to the prevalence of like criminalization of the actors and also the violation of human rights. So it really make me think of like besides direct like violent act, there is also like extractivism is a invisible form of violence because they are like extracting the natural resources at the cost of the well-being and their life of the indigenous community. So I think there is something really alarming and we should pay attention to.
Yeah, there's a lot there in what you said. And I just wanted to highlight that point on criminalization because I didn't mention it. You're right. It was part of that last section as well. Like, so when part of the ways that the state responds is to make things that were formerly available, like protest and dissent, suddenly make them crimes. And we have seen a little bit of that even in Australia, where people have been introducing new crimes of protest. And it can have a chilling effect, and it can prevent the democracy from working to protect the environment. What about you, Joyce? What are your reflections on the chapter?
Yeah, the author talked about the rise of authoritarian governments. So it indicates that the conflicts have shifted from maybe external, like foreign forces to like within the nation. So we need to really come up with a new social order so that we can accomplish our need for economic development without like hurting the environment and without like hurting the people as well.
Yeah, That was such a good point. Yeah. And that's something the author talked about, how there's been new forms of governments in Latin America, you know, from the colonial era and then the dictatorships and then the new democracies and new leftist regimes. But none of them have really been able to address the challenge of protecting the indigenous peoples and the environment. So we need to build that social order together that will allow us to achieve those goals. So great point to end on. Thank you, Joyce. Well, I'll say thank you to Joyce and Andrea for making the recording with me. And I'll also say thank you to our viewers for being with us on this video recording. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Great.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.